All right, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar about grief, especially grief during our COVID experience that we're going through right now. My name is Sarah Sunnix, and I'm a funeral director here at Smith's Funeral Home. And we have locations in Burlington, Grimsby, and Stony Creek. And my guest today is Kirsten Fry, and she is here to help us just dive into this conversation about grief. And so I'm really thankful that she's able to join us, and also for you to be able to join us on this webinar. I just wanted to start by talking about kind of Smith's legacy when it comes to grief and bereavement here. We have a special employee. Her name was Cherry Cross, and she really brought grief and bereavement to the forefront when it comes to funerals and just what we do here at the funeral home. And so I'm very grateful for her. She left a really great legacy here about helping families afterwards. And with her legacy, we have all these resources now available. And, I also want to continue to bring in lots of resources when it comes to grief and bereavement. So Kirsten, it was wonderful that we got to meet recently. It's kind of a fun story. I was on Facebook and I saw a whole bunch of tagging your name as a good person to talk to. And so I wanted to talk to you as being a good resource here in Burlington. So if you don't mind just introducing yourself and where you're from.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that. So my name is Kirsten Fry. I am a transformational life coach here in Burlington with a specialty in the grief recovery method. So I help people that are moving through all the different changes, transitions, and even losses that they're experiencing in life so that they can find different tools and avenues to help with their healing as they move through those processes.
All right, wonderful. So as we go along with this webinar, I want to let our invitees, people who are on here, to have a chance to be able to just say something in the chat. If you do have a question come to mind that you want us to kind of focus on, or if something comes up and it makes you think of something, please use the chat button and we will get to your question or comment. And if you do have anything come up that does give you some hard feelings, make sure you take a second and give yourself that time. So I know sometimes we talk about something that might come up and that might bring up some feelings for yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start asking Kirsten some questions. And that's just something that I think we all kind of go through here, especially at the funeral home. Everyone kind of starts, or at least a lot of people start the grief process here. So it's something really close to our hearts as funeral directors. So my first question is, we're told that everyone goes through some sort of grief in their life. The most common grief event is death. That's basically the biggest one that we kind of think of when we think of grief. But what does grief actually look like? Is it just around death?
No, and that's why I'm so glad that we get to have this conversation tonight, Sarah, with everyone that's going to join us, because grief, even though we all are going to experience grief many times throughout our lifetime, it still remains this really misunderstood an uncomfortable conversation for most people. So this is why I love being able to have these types of conversations with folks, because you're right. I think most people attribute grief to obviously death and divorce. They seem to be the most obvious losses that we would go through in life. But in reality, there's more than 40 different life experiences that can create feelings of grief. And I think most people go, if we're looking at definitions, people kind of expect that grief is sort of the normal and natural reaction to a loss that they'll have. But grief is also all the conflicting emotions that we have when there's an end of or a change in our familiar patterns of behavior. So it's not always just about the experience, but it's often mostly about the relationship and the things that change in addition to the loss and transitions that we go through that maybe don't even have anything to do with death or divorce, but could be retirement or job change or a change in health conditions or financial changes, getting married, having children. So there's all kinds of different reasons why we might have conflicting emotions as we go through our life experiences.
Yeah, and I have heard some people say even this pandemic has caused people to have a lot of grief because they haven't been able to see people or do their normal routines that they're used to. And so that change has been, a form of grief for sure for a lot of people. All right, thank you. So my second question to you is just, I've been noticing that a lot of people who have lost someone during COVID and during this pandemic, they've had a lot of guilt feelings, especially people who are in the nursing homes or long-term care, where they feel like if they had known that that person was going to pass away, they would have tried to visit them more. Some people feel like they passed a lot quicker because they were alone, and feel just very guilty that kind of they should have been doing more, and with the restrictions and trying to keep people healthy, they just decided not to. So how do we help families who are, just dealing with those kind of bigger emotions because of the pandemic?
Yeah, and the pandemic really has amplified so many of these emotions for people in an already difficult situation. Because even if we had a loved one in a long-term care facility with COVID, especially when we were in all these lockdowns, people wanted to get in to see their loved ones, but often weren't able to, or it was limited to only a certain number of people. And so it's completely understandable that people would have this sense of wishing that they could have done more or different or better under the circumstances, but actually had no real option to be able to do that. And so, when we talk about feelings of guilt or shame or upset, beyond just sadness about the loss of our loved one, these are the conflicting emotions that we're talking about with grief. This is all part of the grieving process. And especially when our choices have been limited, and the way that we would celebrate our loved ones, even with funerals where it had to be limited to a certain number of people, that alone is also a difficulty, because that's not how we expected to be able to celebrate the life of our loved one. And so it's understandable that people would be left with a lot of these conflicting emotions as they go through all the different changes and losses that they've had throughout this pandemic. And so what I would say to everybody is, however you feel is completely normal, considering that we've been in this very abnormal situation that we have here. And I would really just encourage everyone to allow yourself some grace as you move through your healing process.
Yeah, we talk here at the funeral home many times. Some families just weren't able to do anything, or they were waiting, for something to open up more. And so the grief has really been prolonged than it might not have been normally. So it has really affected things that we see for sure.
Yeah, and it's this sense of unresolved grief that we have, right? Because it's all the things we maybe didn't get an opportunity to say or share with our loved one, or have them share with us. It's that wishing that things could have been different, better, or more. And it's all sort of all these hopes, dreams, and expectations that we had for the relationship with our loved one that maybe didn't get to be what we wanted it to be. And so that is also like an unresolved part of our grief as we move through that process. And that's what kind of keeps people stuck and feeling sort of those painful emotions, is that unresolved grief. Yeah.
So one of the things I help at the funeral home here, and I really like this position I have, is I help afterwards. We call it aftercare. And my job is to really help people get, CPP benefits, and help them with life insurance, and what to do with the health card and all of those things. And sometimes people, I see them so overwhelmed, but they say things like, oh, I have to keep busy. I got to get this done. I can't have, things falling through the cracks. I have to keep things kind of motoring along. And all I'm thinking is, no, you don't. You can just stop and be sad for a bit. So, how do we kind of help families when they have that, I got to keep busy. I can't just sit. I can't just, cry type of thing. So when we know that might be something they might need.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought this up, and I'm so grateful that you actually have this aftercare program through Smith's, because especially when we're going through an acute loss, like something that's happened in the immediate, oftentimes there's a physical reaction with the grief that we have, not just emotional, but even physically. Appetite is gone, we don't sleep well. It's hard to concentrate and focus on those details that need to be done. And I think what people get confused about is that it's the keeping busy with the natural things that need to be done after the loss of a loved one, with preparing for the funeral or memorial service that you have. And we adapt slowly to the loss, but adapting doesn't necessarily mean that we're healing. And when you talk about keep busy, it's one of the pieces in grief recovery. We have what we call the misinformation that most of us kind of grew up with around grief. And keeping busy is one of those myths that we talk about in grief recovery, because it kind of goes along with the other one, like time heals all wounds. And if we just keep busy, then time will pass and I'll start to feel better about this loss. But the keeping busy, especially if you're someone who's not normally a busy person, like if you tend to have a quieter life, and the advice that you're getting from loved ones that is very well-meaning and well-intentioned is, well, like, just keep busy, just keep going. Well, it's negating the fact that you actually have these normal and natural human emotions around this significant emotional loss. And when we just keep busy with activity, all that's doing is it's displacing the emotions. They don't go away. Emotions are just energy in motion. And so the emotions, we can suppress them and bury them. And many of us have gotten very good at doing that in different ways. But what happens is that when we do finally slow down or take a breath and get quiet, often then that's when those emotions can come up. And for some people with unresolved grief, that can be like months or years later, even, when we don't actually allow ourselves the time to really process the grief and the loss that we're moving through. Because grief, it's universal. We're all going to experience loss throughout our lifetime, but grief is very personal. And so that's the thing that people don't understand, is that I won't understand necessarily the severity or the significance of your loss. I only know what my experience was when I went through my own loss experience. So I can have compassion for someone who's moving through a grieving experience, but I could never say to them, I know how you feel, because the reality is I don't know how they feel, because I wasn't in that same relationship with them or part of that family with them. I can just relate to how I felt when I went through maybe a similar loss like that.
Yeah, and that brings up a really good point. Sometimes, being at the funeral home here, I hear visit at the visitation, I hear families say something that I think might come across as maybe hurtful, or not taken as they might have anticipated it to be helpful, but it's actually hurtful. And some of those examples are, if you've lost your husband, and you're kind of younger, they'll say, well, at least you're young enough to get a new husband or move on that way. Or, if you've lost a child, well, at least you have other children. That one before. And or even when it's a very close person, like my grandmother was my closest person, and sometimes they say, well, she had a good life, she was old, as if it's supposed to mean nothing because she, it was her time, type of thing, right? So obviously we want to try to teach people not to say those things, because they are quite hurtful. But how do we go about kind of helping people in a way that maybe not might come across the way we want it to come across, I guess is a good way to
Yeah. And I think all of us have either heard it or have actually said it to other people throughout our lifetime. And of course, because again, there's this misinformation that we've all grown up with around grief, if it was even spoken about at all. Like, we don't learn about it in school. Think about it. Often, many of us will get like a first aid course through work or school, or babysitting course, something that we do, or CPR course. And, as a former police officer, I had CPR like countless times, but we never got a course or a discussion about grief and loss and what to do about those things. And so I think what happens is, most of the time, again, most people are well-meaning and well-intentioned. They're not saying it to be hurtful, but it's coming from a logical perspective, because I mean, factually, is it true that maybe you have other children? Well, sure, that's factually true, but it's not emotionally helpful. And so we tend to default to our intellect and our logic when we're dealt with a loss, because we're trying to understand it and come to terms with it and accept it. And we feel by saying those things that maybe that will help the person that's going through the loss. And yet I've had so many people say to me, it's like they shut down almost because they feel that that person doesn't understand what they're going through. So I'm not going to actually share how I'm feeling because you don't get it. And so unwittingly, we sometimes create more pain than what we actually wanted to do. And so what I would say is that if you're unsure about what to say, that's okay, because it's hard to watch somebody that we love in pain and knowing that we can't fix it, we can't make it better for them, we can't take away that pain for them. And it's not our responsibility to do that. But what we can do, and what most people, in my experience, grievers are looking for, is they just want to be seen and heard. They want to be able to talk about their loved one and use their name and tell stories and be able to share with them. But oftentimes when we do that, other people in front of us get uncomfortable with that, and we can tell that they're uncomfortable. So we don't want to we don't want to burden people with our grief or our loss, and so we tend not to share. But then that leaves the griever feeling really isolated and lonely sometimes. So what I would say is, if you're unsure what to say, then sometimes just being a heart with ears, just sitting with someone. And, if you have a story to share, if you're part of that family or a friend that, a work person that has a really great story and a great memory that you have that you would like to share with that person, grievers love to hear that. And, I did a survey last year where I asked grievers, what was, people that have experienced loss, what was the most helpful for you in the weeks, months, and, maybe even year after your loss? And everyone said, and it was all different and subjective, but, the drop-offs of the food was lovely, but even like just leaving it at the home and, texting and letting you know that it was there and not expecting that person to come to the door and entertain you and invite you in. Sometimes it was like taking the children for an outing so that you could have some time for yourself. Sometimes it was like months after everything had been done and everything was gone and people sort of went back to their regular life, where it'd be like 4 or 5 months later, someone would come up and drop by and let's go for a walk. And it was those times, after the funeral was over, after the memorial service, and sort of after the weeks of all the busyness that was gone, people really appreciated people still checking in and like, let's inviting them, even if maybe they didn't feel like always going out, but still being included. And always still with the fact that if they wanted to talk about their loved one, that they had a safe space to be able to do that with someone who would allow them to have that time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I heard this from one of the families I was with. He had said he could tell people who had gone through a grief, like a death, by their texts. So anyone texted him and said, what can I do? How can I help? What do you need? He knew they had never grieved the way he was grieving, because it's so much energy to try to think of ways that other people can help you, in grief, and you don't have that energy. Whereas he said the people who texted and said, hey, I'm here for you, let's chat, or I dropped off food at your door, or he even said somebody, I think, cleaned the snow off the roof, like when he was out one day, like just little things like that. He could tell they had been grievers because they knew how to help him without giving him more of a burden at that time, to kind of think of a way, to help them help him, and it's just difficult at that time to put energy into that. So.
And that's a perfect way, because again, we ask the people, I'm here for you if you need anything, but we're putting the responsibility back on them to let us know. And I asked that question as well, and not a single person, I'm here for you if you ever want to talk. The grievers aren't going to be the ones to reach out. They're overwhelmed. It's a loss. It's shocking. And a lot of times their whole world has changed. And like you said, they don't have the capacity or the energy to reach out and ask for that help. And so if you think that there's something you could do, like for me, I know when I went through my divorce, I had friends of mine, their husbands, my girlfriend's husband, like changed my winter tires and did an oil change on my car for me. And, you know, people would come and take my son and take him for an afternoon to play with their kids. And so it's just that if you have something that you can, that you think you can do, then just go ahead and do that for that person.
Yes, for sure, for sure. And I think too, when people have started, you know, kind of going through that process, sometimes you feel like being alone is easier, you know, than having to deal with maybe someone saying something hurtful or needing us in some way. And so a lot of people, you know, have that feeling that they need to be alone. And it's great that we have people like yourself who are available to families. And then we also have other resources that we promote here at Smith's, you know, at Claim Health. They have a one-on-one peer support person, you know, available who has gone through, you know, a loss as well. And, you know, Lighthouse for Grieving Children, they have a wonderful playhouse here in Burlington, which is just great for kids, you know, no matter what, if you're, you know, dealing with a loss with a sibling or a parent or grandparent, they're there to help with the kids, and of course the parents too, trying to deal with, you know, that sort of grief. And, you know, there's a few churches that are running Grief Share, which is a Zoom program. You watch a video and you can share afterwards. And then St. Christopher's does a You Are Not Alone program, which is great too. So, you know, we have lots of other areas, you know, some in Grimsby. We have Rose Cottage Visiting Volunteers, McNally House Hospice, and Bob Camp Hospice. Hospices always kind of have some programs that they run, of course, you know, kind of like a funeral home where they're dealing with people, you know, at that stage as well. So there's lots of different programs that are available, as well as yourself, when it comes to, you know, just being able to have a resource for someone, or, you know, even for yourself, if you're thinking of helping, you know, someone who's going through that process of grief. You know, Acclaim does do training, which is really helpful for families too. So I have another question for you.
Okay.
Share your screen. So, you know, I see when someone has a death, you know, we've all heard that expression, right? Time heals all wounds. And, you know, a lot of people think that when they have a death, it's kind of like this one is like isolated, right? But when I sit with families, you know, inevitably they bring up, you know, deaths that they've had in the past, you know, either a parents or grandparents, or, you know, something might have been traumatic, like a child loss. And it kind of becomes fresh again, you know, especially actually I've had a few families where the parents have passed away very close together, and it feels like they're dealing with a bigger loss because they're both gone at the same time. And so that saying time heals all wounds, does that really line up with grief? Is that really something we should be continuing in our culture?
No, not again. And time heals all wounds is another one of those misinformation that we grew up with. And I think a lot of us heard that. And that's why that one actually goes really well with the keep busy, because we think if we just keep busy, time will pass and I'll start to feel better somehow over that time frame. But in grief recovery, we talk about, so time is going to pass regardless. It's the actions that you take within that time frame that will help you move through the grief that you have. And I think because I think most of us have never been able to really address grief. We've never been given the tools. And for most of us, you know, a significant emotional loss doesn't happen so often that we get used to it and we have ways of coping with it and having resiliency with it. I think in our, like, North America, the average person goes through a significant emotional loss every 7 to 9 years. So while it's not uncommon, it's not happening with any kind of regularity that we can develop sort of these our own tools as we go through. And we can only use what we've learned through our parents or other people that guided us as we grew up, or our own experiences as we move through. And so the time heals is, we use this analogy in grief recovery about like having a car with a flat tire, where, you know, you're tootling along the road and, you know, your car blows a flat, and we get out and we sit on the curb and look at the tire, and it's like, oh, I really wish that tire wasn't flat. And we can sit there and wish about that tire not being flat anymore, but all that's going to happen is we're going to sit there for a really long time and we're not really going to get to where we need to go moving forward. Whereas either, we call CAA, we take an action and call CAA, or we change the tire ourselves. We're taking an action within that time frame, and then we can get back in the car and keep moving forward. And so I think what happens with us is that for so many of us, one of the other myths that we have around grief and loss is that we heard very early on, don't feel bad, don't feel sad. And often we heard that when we were children, because our parents you don't, as a parent, you don't want to see your youngster feeling sad or hurt, or if there was a tremendous loss within the family, we want to protect our kids from the more painful experiences in life. But what happens with that is that we learn to suppress or bury our natural human emotions that come through during a loss of any kind. And then we get really practiced at that with different loss experiences that we have moving forward. So what happens is we become disconnected with our emotions, always defaulting to our intellect, trying to understand and accept the losses that we have. And we can get to that point where we do understand and accept the loss. But again, we've adapted to the loss, we understand it, but we actually haven't healed it, because grief isn't about logic, it's about our hearts, it's our broken heart, and it's our emotions. So, using our heads to heal our hearts is the wrong tool for the job. And that's why, like all the services that you mentioned, including grief recovery, which is the method that I use, helping people move through grief and loss, it doesn't matter what tool you use, as long as, because everybody comes into their healing in their own time, it's what resonates for you, what speaks to you, and where you can feel seen and heard with compassion and respect and dignity without feeling like you're being judged or criticized or trying to be fixed in some way.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't you take a few minutes right now and just share your screen project here so that we can learn more about what you do.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Why don't you share the screen here? So if you want to start using your slides, I know our IT guy has them. So.
Oh, okay. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm in the background here. This is John, and I can just advance the slide. You just tell me when, and
yeah, that would be perfect. So
perfect.
We can walk through it, and it'll cover some of the things that we've already been discussing. But that'd be great. Thanks so much, John. I appreciate that.
No problem.
So coping with loss, we were talking about all these different methods that we can have. And some of us have actually got some really great tools that we've discovered. And maybe we've had people in our lives that were more open about discussing grief and loss as we move through life. So naturally we have ways of completing our losses that we move through. For me, what we're talking about here is for people that are feeling the pain of the emotional loss and feeling maybe stuck in those emotions, whether it's weeks or months or even years after that has happened. So we can go forward. So exactly as we were talking about before, I think most of us understand the first definition of grief, but it's actually that second one for me, when I actually went through my own deep dive into unresolved losses that I had had in my past. It was all these conflicting emotions that we have when we get to the end of, or a change in our familiar patterns of behavior. Because even if we're looking at the grief of the loss of a loved one, losing our spouse is not just the physical loss of our spouse, but it's also all our patterns of behavior about how we move through our day together. What do we do together? How we celebrate things together, the little jokes and little loving things that we have for one another, our physical relationship to one another, all of that has changed and come to an end. So it's not just the physical loss of the person, but also all the plans that we had for our future together, retirement, all the dreams that we had moving forward. And so it's all of that moving forward, and all the things that that person won't be there to celebrate with us as we continue forward in life. So that's part of all those conflicting emotions. And next. So we talked about that there's more than 40 different life experiences, and sometimes experiences that we might not equate to grief. And I can use an example. Our son just graduated from university in April. And so the first 2.5 years, he was able to go to class as per normal. And then for the last year and a bit, obviously all of his classes were online, like so many of our students that we had here. And so in April, he's just graduated from his career in school up to this point, and his degree got mailed to him. There was no convocation, there was no celebration with professors and TAs and friends, and sort of that ritual and ceremony that we have to help us complete one aspect of our life before we move into the next aspect of our life might not seem a significant emotional experience, but when you look at that, it's this conflicting emotions about like, okay, in the degree of a pandemic, maybe that doesn't feel as bad, but you've just completed, 14 years of schooling and your degree gets sent to you in your mail as if it's nothing. And a month later, you're working full time. And it's like that has passed through, but we didn't actually acknowledge that and have that emotional completion around that experience. And so there's a lot of people that are moving through those experiences. My husband retired last year, same situation, 30 years in policing. Just kind of like, thanks for coming out, and things got mailed to him, and that was it. There was no getting together with friends and family and a big, sort of the get together afterwards that you would have at a retirement party. People, same thing with getting married, having babies, big birthdays, loss of family vacations that we've had over this time that we've missed out on. Obviously, like losses of friends and family that we've had over this time frame. So I think, through this pandemic, I don't think we've really seen the full fallout of that. And considering that we're still in the pandemic, we've all sort of adapted to what's happening here, but the healing piece, I think, is still coming through as we move through that situation. And next, John. So again, as we go through the pandemic, as you were saying, Sarah, this perfect example, we're experiencing loss in so many different ways. And, people often will compare losses. Well, it's like, well, I feel bad about my loss, but I can't complain because, oh my goodness, this person lost their husband or their wife, and that's terrible. But when we minimize our losses, there's no difference, because as grievers, we experience our own losses at 100%. And so there is no bigger or less or more. Just grief is grief and loss is loss. So again, in the pandemic, especially, we're seeing the death of our loved ones, being able to visit them in hospital or long-term care, or not being able to have everybody there that you would normally love to have there. Other people have moved through like incredible uncertainty in their physical and financial security. That's been tremendous loss for so many people. Again, even just the loss of familiar routines and activities with children, like not being able to, especially younger children, where this has now gone on for 18 months, which is a big part of their lives. Our next door neighbor has a 4-year-old, and how the socialization and having activities with our kids, those have all shifted and changed. And the big one, as I mentioned, is the rituals, because we are tribal people as human beings, and we need that coming together. Even if you're someone that likes to be on your own, is more introverted and prefers that time on your own, we all still have someone. And so being able to have those rituals and ceremonies and celebrations, we haven't been able to have them the same way. And so that can be an added aspect to the grief that we've already experienced in connection to the loss. Losing our connection to family and friends, again, missing out on those big life experiences, weddings and funerals, and babies being born, and big birthdays and those types of things, graduations, all of those things, we haven't been able to connect with the people that we love, where we would get that love and support and care moving through loss. And then even the intangible losses. So we typically think of losses like something physical, but we have intangible losses, and especially in the pandemic, like everybody's safety and security, trust in either like the information that we've been given through the government and other forms, and even losing our sense of identity. And so that can happen as well as we move through the pandemic. So there's a lot of different ways that grief can be showing up. And sometimes people I've had come to me where they've said, my life is good. I'm not going through like an acute loss, but there's days where I just feel like I can't get out of bed and I'm so tired and I just don't have any energy and I don't have any motivation and I don't know what's wrong with me. And it's like, this is grief. This is all these conflicting emotions. We've had all this change and transition in such a very short period of time that it's not unusual that, yes, even though, we can have technology 24/7 available to us, we're not machines, and we need time to integrate those things that are happening in our world around us. And we need time to sit with them and allow them to integrate and allow us to grieve through them and not just be in this rush to go to the next step and the next thing that has to happen.
Can I just stop you there for a second? So we just got back from vacation, and the best part of the vacation was meeting my niece, because she'd been born. I hadn't had a chance to meet her. And you're right about just needing that connection. It was something I really, really needed. Facebook pictures will not do justice holding my niece, and there is something very natural about that. And it has been a big loss to not be able to do that, for sure.
Yeah. And I think we've been very fortunate with technology, like being able to do presentations like this via Zoom so that we can still have that connection. But a lot of my work is done in person, and there is a difference. So while it is a nice add to have Zoom and all these other things that are available to us to reach out and maintain that contact, the screen is still a barrier. It's not the same as being in the presence of someone else, where you can actually wrap your arms around people and feel that hug and be in the presence of your loved ones. So it's been helpful, but it's not the same. Yeah. And John, if you just want to flip to the next one. Yeah. This is the big one that I really, really hope that people understand, that yes, we all experience loss, but grief is personal because our relationship to that experience or the person is unique. So grief is very unique to us, and each experience that we have is going to be unique to us. And so that's why there's no cookie cutter approach. That's why, there's no real stages that you can say that everybody goes through. And grief is not linear. It is definitely an ebb and flow, very much like the emotions that we're going to have as we go through there. And so that's normal. And that's the thing, people sometimes feel surprised that all of a sudden there's this wave of emotion and they're kind of surprised that it's so strong, like that comes up for them again. And it's like, and that's part of the grieving process. And it's okay to feel your emotions, and it's okay to feel what you're feeling, because if we avoid or suppress or bury those sort of natural emotions, and we tend to do that with the more painful emotions because we don't really know what to do with them, the guilt sometimes that we feel, or the pain or the resentment or those types of feelings, we tend to shut those down. But you can't selectively numb emotion. So when you're shutting down the more difficult emotions, you're also shutting yourself off from the capacity to feel joy and happiness and contentment and satisfaction and peace of mind. And so we end up living in this very kind of tightly controlled box, which is an illusion, because we know that with another loss, like you talked about other families, where all of a sudden now the loss is another like reminder of one that happened before that's still emotionally incomplete for that person. And it's almost like they're right back in it again. And so that's why people tend to avoid the emotional aspect because it's so personal and they feel it so strongly. And what I would really honestly, encourage people is reach out to whatever feels good for you, whatever resonates for you. There's so many services available, so many different options and people that you can speak to. And with the work that you do, Sarah, at the funeral home is like so helpful, especially in that aftercare where people are numb and overwhelmed with the stress of it all, and having someone that can guide you through that experience in a really compassionate, kind, understanding way is a priceless gift. It really is.
Oh, thank you.
So this is the thing to remember, that grief is actually, and it seems like Well, obviously, Kirsten, but we tend to forget about that. We tend to default to our logic and our common sense to try to understand it, but really understand that grief is about that broken heart. And so it's allowing yourself to feel what you feel, get the assistance or guidance that you need, or just the support and love. Allow yourself to be open to that. A lot of us have one of the myths again around grief recovery is this be strong persona. And as a former police officer, I can tell you the be strong, grieve alone. I wore that like a cape for the longest time, because for me, it was at that time, I really felt like, well, if I am vulnerable somehow, am I, will people lose their confidence in me to be able to do the job that I was doing at the time, which was in policing? But there is a time and a place for everything. You do need to be in a safe space that you trust the person that you're talking to about your loss. It's very important to have that safe space. And not everybody deserves necessarily to hear your story. That's the other thing. So it really is about understanding that it's okay to have those emotions. And if you need help or guidance to move through that process, there's so many available people and services that can help you with that.
Yeah, I always think of, when people are really upset, I'll say, it's because of your connection with this person. That connection was so strong that now that connection's gone, you're really feeling it, right? Kind of the idea of broken heart. And, my relationship with my mother might not look like your relationship with your mother, and that connection with your mother might have been stronger, than you might have with your spouse or with your children, so when that loss is gone, it's that broken heart, it's that connection that was so strong that you're now grieving, so I try to think of it that way.
Oh my gosh. And that's such a beautiful way to say that and share that with people, because again, we hear that, like, I know how you feel. We hear that often. And I would just remind people to be cautious about that, exactly for that reason, because like for myself, my relationship with my mother was a less than loving relationship. And so, as you said, you can lose your mother and you had like this really connected, awesome relationship with your mom. And I had a totally different relationship. So yes, we both have a similar loss, but our grieving experience around that loss is going to look completely different and very unique for that relationship and that experience for you. So I love that you share that with people and let them know that, even within families. And that's the thing, I'm sure you must see this too at the funeral home, where the loved one has died, but each person in that family has had their own unique relationship with the one that has died. And so sometimes you see, even within families, misunderstandings about how someone is grieving the loss. And, they feel like there's some judgment around that person, not being, showing emotion, or the other person showing too much emotion, or whatever the case may be. And yet, because everybody has their own unique relationship with the loved one, it's going to look different for everybody, even within the same family.
Mm-hmm, for sure. We do see that.
So these are the 6 myths that we talk about in grief recovery. And so like the don't feel bad, don't feel sad. Again, we hear that because people are uncomfortable around painful emotions. And so, they legitimately don't want you to feel bad. But in doing that, sometimes you're shutting people down from really being able to share how they're feeling in that moment. And that often starts when we're younger. We hear that more often. But even as we move through like changes in our lifetime, I'm thinking about even as you move through school and you fall in love for the first time and your heart gets broken with, your first boyfriend or girlfriend. And we hear this all the time. Don't feel bad. There's plenty of fish in the sea. Like there's even an app around that. Like that's how prevalent that particular myth is. And it fits into that replacing the loss, where we're very quick to fill the space with, usually that's a pet that starts with us at a very young age. In relationships, you often see this often before we've really become emotionally complete with the loss of the relationship, no matter what loss that was, before we move into the next relationship. But what happens is everything that's incomplete for us from that original relationship is going to come with us into that next one. And this is why often we see people having the same type of relationship, even if it's with different people, because we're trying to replace the loss. The grieving alone, I think, oh, sorry, did you want to say something to that? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard you say something. And then the grieve alone piece, I think for a lot of us, that was mine. That was modeled for me at an early age when my mother lost her dad, my grandfather, and they were in Germany. So I didn't really have a relationship with him. I was 10 at the time. But what really impacted me was seeing my mother cry. And that was the first time I'd ever seen my mother cry. So it was like shocking for me. And I recognized that, oh, this is a big situation. And really wanting to go and comfort my mom, and being told like by my dad, just give your mom some time, just leave her alone, let her have her time and space. And so, that was and that was kind of continuously modeled throughout my, growing up, is that, oh, so we grieve alone these losses that we have. But that just gets really lonely for a lot of us, where we don't get the opportunity to move through that emotional piece. The time heals, we already discussed, and the be strong. And for a lot of us, that's we're in that persona. We see this a lot too with men, I find, because that whole don't feel sad, don't feel bad. While we all heard this growing up, like big boys and big girls don't cry, men really have heard that so much more in a different way and more consistently, sort of growing up through a societal pressure where it's almost like not okay for men to show up with emotion, because that would be vulnerable, and vulnerable somehow means that you're weak. And so for a lot of men, what we have seen through my work in grief recovery is that men get really disconnected often with their emotion, and they will often fall back to getting the stuff done, falling back on their intellect. But that emotional energy doesn't go away, which is why in a lot of cases, men struggle more in terms of like suicide and addictive type behaviors and anger management type issues, because that emotional energy needs to go somewhere. If you have a lifetime of pain and loss that you haven't had an outlet for, it needs to go somewhere. And so that be strong persona can be really limiting for us in a lot of different ways, and keep us from the love and support that we actually need when we're going through a significant loss. And then the stay busy, you already so perfectly described how that can look for a lot of people. And again, for someone who maybe isn't normally a busy person, that being told to stay busy can feel like pressure to do something that already feels foreign for them in the first place. Whereas someone who's normally a busy person, that actually might feel good for them in terms of helping them through their loss, because that feels like more like their normal routine and behavior and that type of thing. So it really is unique as we go through these experiences. So we have to be really careful about the pat answers that we say to people. And sometimes if we feel uncomfortable, it's often sometimes best just don't say anything and just be there. Be a listening ear for people.
Mm-hmm.
So in grief recovery, we often talk about these short-term energy relieving behaviors, again, because grief is emotional. And so there's a lot of emotional energy that comes up with grief and loss. And again, it can be all these conflicting emotions. So it could be anger, it could be sadness, it could be guilt or shame or resentment or, relief even sometimes when it comes through. And so we need ways to sort of help us relieve that pent up emotional energy if we don't have an outlet. So for a lot of us, we call them stewards in grief recovery. Most of these, with the exception of maybe drugs, taken in moderation, there's nothing wrong with most of these things. They're regular activities. It's when we use these items like that are listed on here, especially with like Netflix, the online shopping, the food, the alcohol, when we're using that to displace our emotions, to avoid the emotions that we're actually coming up with, it works in the short term, which is why we call them this. But in the long term, that emotional energy isn't going anywhere. We're just kind of like pushing it down, suppressing it, and burying it. And what happens is grief compounds over time. So if we don't actually address it, it will be that one loss that maybe doesn't feel as significant, but all those ones that we haven't really actually allowed ourselves to be emotionally complete with, they all come up and we all have a point where we just hit it, where we're full, and that's enough, and that's all we can take. So it's just being conscious of those patterns of behavior that we have when we're trying to avoid our emotions, to look at why and understand that, when are some of these things now becoming maybe hurtful for us, as opposed to just, an activity that we enjoy doing.
So there is a question that's just come up, and someone just asking why it's called grief recovery. I know you've been using that term quite a bit.
So you've shared that there's many services and different methods to help people through grief and loss. And the method that I use is something called the grief recovery method. It has been around for 40 years. It was just evolved through John James, who actually just died this month. And he created grief recovery when back in the 70s, he and his wife lost a son 3 days after he was born. And he was so overcome by his grief and loss, he was looking for things to help him move through that. And there really wasn't anything available at that time. And so for him, this sort of started as a very grassroots thing. And now grief recovery, which is now an evidence-based education program that has therapeutic benefits. So it's not therapy or counseling. And I am not a therapist or a counselor. I'm a life coach with a certification in grief recovery. But it's been shown to help people move through discovering what is emotionally incomplete for them from a loss of any kind, and take those action steps that we talked about as they move through their time of healing to help them get emotionally complete, so that they're not taking those painful emotions with them into the future and not limiting themselves for their capacity for happiness moving forward. And so I love the work that I do. It's very healing and therapeutic in ways, even without it being therapy. And I've never had anybody go through grief recovery and say they wish they had never done it. It also helps people be a better support for other people in their lives who are going through their own losses. So it changes the information that we learned about grief, which is why the education part of it is so, so important. And that's why I'm so grateful for you, Sarah, for inviting me to come have this conversation with you today, because it really is about allowing us to have these open, honest conversations about grief and loss, because it's part of our human experience. And I think the more that we can do that in open, safe, honest space is just more helpful to more people who are grieving. So what works? What can be helpful, as you were asking about before? So when people ask us, how are you doing? Most people, like, what do you hear most of the time when you ask people, how are you doing?
Usually they say, I'm fine.
Yeah. And that's what most of us say. And we might not actually be fine at all in that time frame. But again, because we've grown up with, we don't want to be a burden. This person doesn't actually want to hear what I'm feeling, because it's all going to come out and I might start crying and all the rest of it. And people are often very nervous about having tears flow. And for me, I'm always like, own your tears, because that's your body's natural wisdom and helping you relieve some of that pent up emotional energy. So tears are very healing. And so never be ashamed of your tears, because it's actually your body doing what it's meant to do to help you relieve some of that emotional energy. So be truthful, but knowing that it needs to be somebody that you trust and that you feel safe being able to share that with them. In grief recovery, we talk about being a heart with ears, which is really being able to listen to someone talk about their loved one or their loss experience without trying to fix anything for them, not trying to be judgmental or analyze or criticize or offer advice unless it's asked for. And that's what we have here. It's really just being about being present with the person, being patient, especially with an acute loss, because again, people's minds it's difficult. Grief affects our cognitive function. And so we'll forget what we're saying, we'll drop things and forget things. And so really being patient with someone and letting them finish what they have to say without interrupting them or chiving them along to finish what they're saying. It's just be present, be patient, and know that it can be really painful to talk about loss. So that if you feel uncomfortable while they're talking about that loss, that's okay. And it's also something to be aware of, that maybe there's something unresolved for you as well that's coming up when someone else is experiencing their loss experience. So when you can allow them to feel listened to and feel safe, you're actually doing like one of the best things that you could possibly do for people, is just to feel so that they feel seen and heard in that moment.
When I sit with families, I always try to give myself the mindset that I'm supposed to be a safe spot for them to talk. So, if someone does say something, I don't want them to have any judgment, or, I just kind of think I'm going to be like a safe space for them to say what they need to say. And I think that's a good thing to think in our minds.
Yeah, it is, because we live in this world that's so like hurry up, rush, rush. But when we've had a significant emotional loss, like the death of a loved one, like our world has slowed right down and everything else is happening around us, and people are in such a rush and moving on. So when you actually take the time and are patient and can listen, that's the feedback that I get from a lot of people, is that they like, I felt seen and heard, and I feel comfortable being able to talk about this. And that's healing in and of itself. Never mind the action steps that you take afterwards, but just being able to express the truth of the loss and what that is for you. It's very, I find it, for me, it's very, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to sit in that space with people.
Mm-hmm. Now, we did have a question from somebody about any legacy activities that we might be encouraging families to do. I know for my own personal family, we took one of the flannel shirts from my grandfather and made that into a pillow. And there's some really great things that a lot of people have done, that you can kind of pull from Facebook or from online when it comes to legacy. But personally, I don't really have that as something I have been working with families. I don't know about your experience with legacy projects, but
for me, I've had a couple of things where, like with like often you'll send like gift baskets and so on for someone that's gone through a loss. And what I found is actually like a tree for, like, we've had clients who really love their gardens, and so like a specific flower or a tree or something that they really love to plant in their memorial. People really love that piece of it. And honestly, the legacy projects can be as creative and unique as the person and the relationship that you had. And I would just say, whatever feels, I guess what really resonates for you, was meaningful to you, that would be like a beautiful way to do it. I'm sure that you would see more of that with what you do with all the people you see through the funeral home. Mm-hmm. So many great ideas that people have.
I know we do take a thumbprint of family members, and we offer that so people can use that for jewelry. But one person actually used it to make a tattoo, so that was an interesting thing they did.
Oh,
so yeah, like you said, anything that you feel would be honorable for what your person,
yeah, and that's the thing. It's like actually allowing. Because it'll be as personal as that relationship was. And so we all have those special things. So whatever that would feel like for you, I would encourage you, like if that helps as part of your healing process, absolutely take that in for sure.
All right, we should keep going. I can't believe it's already 8 o'clock.
Oh my goodness. Excellent. So just in terms of like the work that I do, these are some of the methods that and resources that I have available. So if there's anybody that's on the call tonight that is interested in learning more about the myths about grief that we were talking about, that goes into a little more in depth than what we did, I'm happy to send you the link, Sarah, or if somebody wants to reach out to me, and I will send them that link, that ebook for them. In terms of other resources, the Grief Recovery Handbook is part of what I use in my work with people when I give them that package. That's the book that we work from. And all of these books, the next four, the Grief Recovery Handbook, When Children Grieve, the Pet Loss book, and also Divorce and Relationship Loss, all those books are available on Amazon and can be ordered by anyone. And so the When Children Grieve book is excellent if you're looking for a way to break sort of the generational misinformation that we hand down to children around grief and loss. Is a beautiful book to have.
All right, so this is the end of our presentation, and you know, I feel like that hour just went by so fast. Yeah, that's great. We had a lot to discuss, so that's always a good thing. So this is just my information, how to get in touch with me, obviously here at the funeral home, and my email and our website, as well as for Kirsten. Her information, her phone number, and she does service the Burlington area. So, or you might run into her on Facebook like I did. I'm very grateful for. So thank you so much to all of you who joined in tonight, or if you're watching this, you know, at a later time, because you do want to have some more resources around grief, you are welcome to get in touch with us at any time. So thank you again for joining me tonight. And I also want to thank Guaranteed Funeral Deposits of Canada. That's who I use for my pre-arranging. They've hosted our webinar tonight, and they will be recording it as well. So thank you again, and take care of each other, okay? I'm gonna say goodbye.
Good night, everyone.